Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy. Great. Well, Jorge, welcome back.
Thank you.
Well, excited to talk through the technical portion here. So the ball's in your court. I know you do something a little different than the traditional whiteboarding style leak code thing. So I'll let you take it away here.
Awesome. So I see that you have a project called Reach Out. Can you just give me from a product point of view, like a quick demo of what you're trying to accomplish with this website?
Yes. So the goal of Reach Out is basically to allow or make it easier for people to stay in contact with people they care about, right? So myself, and I'm sure many others are bad about calling your family members or your friends, right? And sometimes you realize, oh, it's been weeks, right, since I last talked to them, right? So Reach Out basically lets you to set up these reach outs or these reminders that'll text you every time you want to or whatever schedule you set and remind you to reach out to this person. So this is my brother here with, I guess I should probably blur out his number, but my brother created him as a contact and Reach Out, right? If I go to the Reach Outs page, I have one made already, but basically, let's see, maybe I can scroll this in. Weekly, it's going to send me a text saying you should text Jonas. And because I also have an API or a couple different APIs I've implemented where it'll also send some type of idea of what we should talk about, right? So I've had news for him. Sports is probably better, right? So the sports one would pick some type of sports headlines, would probably say something about the Heat beating the 76ers last night, right? And then I would go, oh, I haven't talked to Jonas since last week, right? Let me text him about, hey, what's up with, or did you see that game last night, right? Something like that. So that's the idea, which I think still functions here. If I click this right now, it should, if I turn my phone off airplane mode, it should send me a text basically confirming that Reach Out exists. So we'll see if it comes through.
First of all, this would be very handy for me. Having all my family in Spain, believe me, this is a challenge during the weekdays trying to reach out with them.
Yeah. All
right, and you were telling me that you built this project using Ruby on Rails and Vue.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yep.
How did you use them, and why did you decide to pick those two frameworks?
Yeah, Rails is what I was most familiar with from as far as a backend language and comfortable with, and it also, at the time, because I was the most familiar with it, it seemed fairly straightforward to get it up and running. I was just clicking through the code a little bit, and it's actually not that complex of an application. I mean, that's the models, really, right? So it's a handful of files, and the controllers I don't think were super complicated either, right? It was a little bit of I think the bulk of this work was doing this kind of scheduling work, and then getting the Twilio API, since it's actually sending text messages, getting that up and running as well. So that was why I picked Rails, just because I was most familiar with it and it seemed pretty straightforward. And then Vue, it was a cool front-end framework. That was the real idea. I probably could have built it in vanilla JavaScript, that I probably would have been more comfortable in that, or vanilla JavaScript and jQuery, but Vue was just what I was messing around with. And it was straightforward-ish at the time to do. I don't know if I could recreate it all today, but it seemed to make sense at the time.
So humor me a little bit, because it's been so many years since I did anything web-related with Rails. And actually, when I did Rails the last time, front-end frameworks and single web application, web page applications were not even a thing, right? So why would you like, for example, with Rails, right? Like you have your HTML views and you can like render that in the server side and all the stuff. under which circumstances, like, or what would be kind of like that decision-making process to introduce a front-end framework? Like, what are you trying to achieve with that?
Yeah, great question. Again, when I built this app, it was just to utilize this framework that I thought was interesting. If I went back and did it now, like I'm pretty familiar with using like HAML files, HTML and HAML files in Rails, and it would probably be a lot easier to do this because I mean, this isn't the craziest front end in the world, right? Like you could slap that together pretty quickly. But at the time, it was something that I wanted to try and mess around with. I don't think if you really ask me like why, I would say maybe it would scale better in the future, right? Like I do touch some see, messy would be a nice word. Some messy HAML files right now where basically it's when you got to edit something, it's pretty extensive trying to dig through exactly what's going on. And that's with an organization that, you know, we're owned by Kroger right now. So it's a pretty large company. Something like this, which we're actually shifting a lot of our HAML files to React, does make it much more easier to use and much more componentable. I don't know the right term for that, right? But it's a much easier to reuse than trying to do a bunch of little partials and ERB things.
So with Ruby on Rails, you were building then like a API that was returning JSON, or how did that work?
Yeah, I believe the backend is basically just returning JSON that's all being routed to this front end.
Awesome.
Ooh. Crazy JavaScript to make the theme and the navbar work correctly. Documentation, at least.
That's something. So were you able, for example, to generate like any API documentation for this project? Like if you wanted to imagine like an API blueprint or like some markdown or something like that, where did you create that? Is that something that it would be available? And if not, like what do you think would have to happen to create that?
No, I didn't make something like that. That would make sense to do. So the main, I guess, adaptation that would have to happen is basically trying to define all of the context and the reach outs, right? Like defining those correctly, which wouldn't be that hard. I mean, this is pretty, again, straightforward set of criteria. It's not the most complicated things. And then basically writing update, delete functions for that. That would be straightforward. It would make sense to do. A lot of the nice part of this is, I would say, the most complicated piece was getting the texting set up, which is Twilio had and I think now has much better documentation, right? So it's all pretty straightforward there for, say, the complicated piece of this.
All right. I imagine that this is your pet project, but we're gonna do an exercise of imagination.
Sure.
You are like putting this in the market and it's like blowing everyone's mind, right? And you see yourself needing to bring a new developer, let's say an intern. Like, hey, I'm gonna have someone else helping me. And the first feature that you wanna tackle is that you also wanna send an email instead of a text notification, right? But of course, you're very busy running operations, so you're not going to be coding the feature. You're going to be mentoring someone to do so. Guide me through that process of how would you try to approach that, kind of like, let me onboard you to the code base and try to introduce them to the new feature, and what guidance would you give that new developer to be effective adding that email support?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a good feature to think about for the future. So I think as far as like getting an understanding of the application, I think I would try to walk them through the backend logic first of like, this is what we're doing. Here's a lot of this is pretty straightforward. And I try to write it in a pretty readable way. I would basically talk through that with them and make sure they understand the different pieces of this application and what it's doing now and kind of how it's doing it. And then after kind of trying to do a little bit of an info dump there, explaining, okay, we want to build similar functionality. I don't think Twilio will do emails, right? But we're going to find a similar service to do a similar thing, right? And then give them some basic idea around, we would probably have some selector of if email, right, we're going to go down this path, or if text, we're going to go down this path, right? I might have them. There'd probably be two different sections of this. Like, let's figure out how to do the front end piece, right? Which might be the first thing I'd send them, just because I feel like it is easier for a lot of people to get up and running on some front end stuff. And then while they're doing that, and try to figure out, okay, how do we, what do we just need some other set of topic. We're doing text or email, right? Just another drop down box. Like, that's something they could probably replicate. Now that we're doing that, then start to research email options, right? And then helping them do some maybe educated Googling around what is a scheduled email. I don't know the right term for it, but help them basically find that and maybe put together, okay, these are the three that I think make sense. And then let's talk about the one we actually want to implement, right? And make sure that it works for us. Probably sit down and talk through that with them. And then as far as actually building that might be probably the most difficult piece for them, right? Is like actually implementing it. But just walking through, like, okay, we don't want to actually send live emails yet, right? Let's just test these emails and make sure like we're sending them to ourselves in some internal account. And then we can start to set this up and do some testing around it.
So it's great that you're mentioning testing. What type of testing would you recommend to do for that functionality? How would you also like make sure that you don't end up like emailing your production users? Like, guide me a little bit through like environment setup or testing that you would think would be effective for this project.
Yeah, great question. I am not a testing expert by any means, and I'll say
no one is an expert in that area, right?
I'll say this most recent job is the first time I'm writing tests with any regularity. So I think about testing sometimes when I'm not doing a lot of it. As far as how would we do this environment setup, I think we could make her basically set some type of environment setting where we're only doing this in development, right? Like, we're setting development to true rather than production to true when we're testing our emails. As far as like actually writing tests, we could probably build RSpec tests and use the documentation of whatever email provider or email API provider that we're going to work with. They probably have, or hopefully have, good documentation around like, this is how to send your first email and how to write tests around this. It's kind of an interesting idea of how would we, I don't know the ins and outs of like emails if we're getting a return of like email delivered, but we're probably getting something like that. If we're not, there's also probably some way to check, is it present in an inbox, right? That might be some type of RSpec, add-on that we'd have to do. But basically, if we control the inbox, we could also test, is this email present, within 5 minutes of sending it, right?
I think if I remember correctly from my Rails days, maybe we want to open Google and research this. But I think that there's something called Action Mailer that might allow you to even, I don't know, maybe I'm getting it all wrong.
Yeah, that does sound familiar.
Yeah, let's take a look to see what we could do here. So it looks like it could be kind of like generate a mailer, a notifier. I think it would be really hard to detect if an email has landed to someone else's inbox.
Yeah.
But I think you get a confirmation pretty much, because also you get a confirmation if that email doesn't exist. So probably you would get some sort of like message back, but
message delivery. Yeah. Okay. So if we might be able to set up if it was actually delivered or not.
What do you think would be, just by looking at this, can you envision any pros and cons of using this solution?
Yeah, I've used Action Mailer. It's been a couple of years, but I do remember, and this could be an issue with any thing we use, but I do remember it was always like a weird, because we had to basically set up, like whenever we were testing on localhost, we had to set up kind of fake emails that would send, because we weren't actually connecting to anything, right? So we didn't have an active email account that we were sending anything out to. So we were just testing, does this show up in the console or not, right? Which was kind of an interesting way to do it. And it was like, it was kind of hard to wrap my head around at the time. And it seems like now still, I haven't thought about it since then, but it was like just a weird problem of, the reason Action Mailer isn't working on local is because we're not actually sending an email to anything, right? We're just sending a message and then it's pinging back to us and show up again in the console.
I also think that probably if we were building, let's say that you want to track some sort of like engage, like maybe this is not the case for like email notifications, but if we wanted to send, for example, like email campaigns and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Right. You want to, like, one of the cool things about Twilio is like, you use their platform, they deliver the message, right, and do all the heavy lifting and all the stuff. And then you can even monitor in their dashboard, like, what's going on, right? So there may be even solutions that might do that heavy lifting for you, but like, I was just curious about, it just kind of like popped in my mind, and I was like, oh, I knew about this. It might be interesting to look at it together. No, but that's cool.
There's probably some, I don't know, admin paneling for Action Mailer, but I'm assuming it's a lot less informative than something, a company that's specifically built around email.
So let's imagine that you've been working with your new developer, right? She's amazing, and they deliver the feature and all the stuff, so it's time to put it on the market. And you're like, well, I'm still busy running a business. Let me coach you to deliver this to production. What steps would you kind of like take with your new developer to deploy this?
Yeah, I would probably try to walk them through what a deploy looks like. Like for this in particular, just because I built it in a weird way where the front end and the back end are kind of like shoved into the same repo. I have like a README, right, that I could share with them of like, this is the actual steps. But as far as like understanding this, and like, how would we do this effectively? I would probably try to explain like feature flags, or is there a way we can roll this out to some percentage of our customer base? And then we can test that, right? If 20% of people, we get no errors, or do we get a ton of errors, right? Or like, then we can make some improvements and then continue from there. This is deployed on Heroku, which does make it pretty easy. So they could actually deploy it from their local environment, and I'd be able to help them get that set up again with the README. But I think deploying is one of the scariest things as a early career engineer. So like, I try to do as much handholding as possible when it comes to that, because any error can seem like, oh, am I taking the entire site down, right?
Yeah. I think in these cases, especially as you kind of like grow your team and things like that, that's where, like, for example, like testing starts to matter a lot, because you have more hands in the code base, right? Like, not everyone might, like, especially if the code base grows, you might not have the entire context of like, hey, if I make a change here, how might it be affected somewhere else, right? But also as you grow your testing strategy, right? Like, it might even give you more comfort to do automated deploys, right? Like, hey, every night we deploy to an staging environment. I'm of the opinion that like, actually, I like to deploy as often as possible. Like, pretty much if I can merge and then push even to production, great, right? Like, we should have some trust in our test, right? But like, it takes time to develop that, especially if you've never written tests and all that stuff, right? I see that you have in there a GitHub folder. I'm curious to see what you have in there. Can we open it?
Let's see. Oh, I got some templates. Okay, a bug report template.
All right.
Future
that's pretty cool. Have you ever used GitHub Actions for their workflows?
I have used GitLab Actions
or something
quite a bit. Yeah.
All right, tell me a little bit about what do you use it for?
Yeah, so we have a pipelining. I don't even think it's a test. It's basically it tests. It'll spin up a build and see if that passes all the tests. Right now at work, and that's something that's part of our deploy process. In the past, I had a GitLab Actions that part of that pipeline was also running all of our tests before anything got released. And then it was just a syntax one too. It was some version of like JavaScript linter, right? That would standardize some things. Those are both helpful, and that would probably be useful too, right? For if I was bringing someone on board of making sure, okay, we're running a build process and actually running these tests every time before anything actually gets deployed, right?
Awesome. The other, and I think this probably, like, I could end the interview, like the technical part with this, but tell me a little bit about what database solution you're using and why you decided to use that solution. And I know that you're deploying in Heroku, so I'm also interested to learn if you're using the same solution locally versus in your deployed environment. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's a Postgres database right now. I don't know what version, but it's, I would say, not super complicated. The Heroku is also just it's a Heroku hosted database. That's a Postgres database also. And right now, I think they're probably almost a 1-to-1, just because there's not a ton of stuff that's in the live application that isn't on local. But
do you keep those databases separate, or are they the same instance?
They're separate. Yeah.
Why do you keep them separate?
Probably because I didn't know how to sync them at the time, or to do any type of like regular automated syncing. If I was thinking of this from like a production app standpoint, right, then I would want to make sure we're actually standardizing those, or yeah, I think just making sure that they're synced. I'm trying to think how we do it now at work. I guess our local
thing that probably you don't want to keep them in sync, and I'll tell you why, right? When working on your local host, you might need to create new records, delete them, or whatever that is, right? So you don't want to be using the same instance as what you might have in Heroku, like especially if it's your production environment, just so you don't destroy that data, right?
Yeah.
I would imagine that you actually, because you're using Rails, they're sharing the schemas, right? So you always have the same table structure, the same migrations, right? But the data that they hold is different.
Yeah. That makes sense. I know right now it's really great. We have as long as I run, this weekly command, it'll pull down a copy, and then it takes a half hour, but it standardizes everything, and it changes all the usernames and the passwords and everything, which makes it very easy compared to a lot of times in the past where I've quarterly you pull down whatever the most recent data is and hope nothing breaks, right?
That's great. All right, this was a really good technical walkthrough. As I told you before, there's one question that I always like to ask, and that question is like, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you wanted me to ask?
So, my normal answer when I'm doing interviews is, if we haven't talked about, I host a podcast about technical interviews. I bring that up just because I do think it's an interesting thing, right? But as far as this application, the other kind of piece of my career that I'm interested in is like security stuff. I haven't done a ton of that work, but I'm always kind of interested. This application, that would be the number one thing keeping it from going to any type. Like, I'm not going to charge anyone for this because I would be scared to even take their credit card information. But that's stuff that I've thought about a lot with this application. It's like, okay, if I wanted to implement Stripe and start processing payments, right, or charging based off a certain threshold of reach outs, right, what would that look like, and then what type of security work would I need to do around that, right? And that's just something that I'm interested in and always curious about what other companies do in the security realm, and if they feel like, oh, we got a really good handle on it, or we also probably should think about that more, right?
That's a fascinating space in which I have -3 knowledge.
Sure.
What do you find so fascinating about that field?
I just think it's overlooked so often, but like critically important, right? It's almost like testing in a certain sense, where like nobody talks about it unless it's an issue, right? Like testing is like, my wife was a QA engineer for many years, right? And she's like, we never get praise, we just get, oh, this is broken, right? And I think it's the same thing with security, where if you're not talking about security, means someone's doing their job, right? Or someone's really not doing their job. And it's just a space that I think needs to be talked about more as we see it feels like every week there's some major company that's being breached, something like that, right? And it's a tough space too. That I don't know. The good guys are losing, right? Which isn't something that we hear a lot in engineering. Is like we're not really getting better at this. We're actively getting worse at this thing, right? So it's just something that I think about.
I'm really glad to hear that. Yeah, there's some topics that are overlooked, security being one. Thing like accessibility, internationalization, right? Like those are topics, especially in the front end world, that are kind of like an afterthought, right? Because like people, they design for the 75% of the population, but there's a extra 25% that they're craving for like digital experiences that they feel left out, right? So they're fascinating topics, right? And I think that the challenges here, they're not technical, they're cultural, right? Which is kind of sad a little bit, but I think things are getting better. One of the things, actually, going back to Flutter, I don't want to sound like a broken record, right? But just even the default support for like good like accessibility guidelines and things that you're gonna get from free just from the stack, it's amazing. Actually, one of the things that I like the most is that you can test accessibility. And given that we are so nerds about testing, it's one of those things that we want to roll out as soon as we can. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, accessibility, I feel like, is actually, I hear it talked about more now, which is great. And I actually know several people who like have, similar to Flutter, right? That's their whole space now, right? They run consulting companies just around accessibility, and they're like, okay, you don't have that at all, right? We're going to come in and basically rebuild your entire application so it actually optimizes for that. And that's I don't know, really interesting to see.
Yeah. So during the interview, I wanted to kind of like share some feedback with you to make it effective, right? It's funny because we never got to kind of like understand like, hey, we're going to be chatting about this tech stack and things like that before this, right? So even for you, like presenting this project was news to you today, probably, right? I've done Ruby on Rails, but many, many years ago. Definitely, I don't understand Vue. Like I've never had to work with it, right? So as I said, one of the things that was very interesting is like how the conversation flows, right? How do you react to questions? Which I think there's like you are very natural to this, right? I think also like probably being part of the podcast is giving you like a certain level of kind of like how to navigate this, right? And this is not really an interview, right? So it's a different level of stress, but I really appreciated that you've been engaging in the conversation. You've been honest in the areas in which like, I feel comfortable with this, let me explain it to you. And you've been also very transparent in those areas in which like, you know what? I'm learning how to test applications. I'm learning how to use RSpec and all that stuff, right? Which to me now sets the tone of like, well, even if we had to work together, that might be an area in which like, let's get that out of the way. Let's build that confidence, right? You clearly know your Ruby stuff. The front end looks beautiful, right? It looks very polished. So that's a huge plus as well, right? I think that as we were kind of like talking, clearly you can tell that this is like a side project, right? If you were working like probably like at work, as we were saying, like you might have automated deployments that could be like a black box for you, right? Like you don't even need to learn about that. But as you kind of like keep progressing in your career, those topics will end up in your plate, right? There's a right time and place for all of those, and there's nothing that is going to prevent you from being like, oh, this is something that I have to do. Let me go and research it, right? So I think from that point of view, I'm very happy with what I've seen. Most importantly, I think that it was like a fun, engaging conversation that proved what's our starting point, right? Like where do we want to grow? And we got to explore a little bit together about Action Mailer, which I did not remember a thing, right? So that was fun as well.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Do you have any feedback for me?
No, it's great. I mean, and I think you did a good job of like probing in certain areas, and it led me to go like I didn't remember Action Mail either, but I do remember now, like, oh, I spent 2 days staring at a screen trying to figure out why this email wasn't actually sending until someone said, just look at your console, it's showing up there, right? I'm like, oh, and it's just like little stuff like that comes back out. So good questions.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, thanks so much. It's been a blast. Can you give us the plug one more time here for Very Good Ventures and anywhere else that people can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Very Good Ventures, we're like a Flutter agency. Flutter is a portable UI toolkit, right? So pretty much anywhere where there's a screen, mobile, your computer, your smart fridge, the Jumbotron Plus Stadium, you should be able to run your Flutter applications there, right? We have a presence in the US, but also like in Poland, in Portugal, in Spain, in Brazil, which is super exciting, right? So if you want to reach out to me, like you can find me on Twitter under J Coca Ramos or on LinkedIn as well. But yeah, it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thanks so much.
Awesome.
Thank you for watching the technical interview portion of the Professional Technical Interviewee. If you want to tackle this interview question, you can find it at github.com/professional technical interviewee. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Dorsett or on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.